There is a grave in Los Angeles, down in San Pedro, and it's a remarkably simple headstone. Nothing grandiose, no marble angels, no weeping willows, just a flat marker, right there in the grass, and carved into it, right beneath a little silhouette of a boxer, beneath the dates of his life, are just two words, "Don't try," which is such a profoundly counterintuitive epitaph, especially in an American culture that is completely obsessed with relentless effort, optimization, and hustling. But you really have to look at the life of the man buried under that dirt to understand the weight of those two words. His name was Charles Bukowski, and for the vast majority of his life, by almost every conventional metric we use to measure a successful human existence, he was a spectacular failure. He was a chronic alcoholic. He suffered from severe physical ailments, mostly because of his lifestyle. He spent around 14 years sorting mail at a post office in a soul-crushing routine. He got fired from jobs constantly, and he spent decades being brutally, repeatedly rejected by every single literary magazine and publisher he sent his work to. Not to mention his personal relationships were chaotic, disastrous wrecks. He was, in his own words, a mess. And yet, against all logical odds, he is ultimately one of the most recognizable and most influential poets of the 20th century, which makes him the perfect foundational anti-hero. And Mark Manson uses him to introduce the central philosophy of his massively polarizing, globally recognized book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are going through a towering stack of research today, ranging from the original text to deep psychological critiques, heated Reddit debates, and independent reviews. And starting with Bukowski is a very deliberate structural choice by Manson, because we need to dismantle a massive misconception right out of the gate. If you just read the casual summaries, or if you just glance at that bright orange cover with the profanity slapped across the title, it is incredibly easy to assume this book is a manifesto for total apathy. The cultural translation of not giving a frick usually means chilling out, letting everything slide, and just becoming this detached, cool, unbothered person. Someone who glides through life completely unaffected by anything. But that assumption is a fundamental misreading of not just the text, but of human biology itself. The premise that you can simply choose to stop caring is not how we work. We are neurologically wired to care. Evolutionary psychology tells us that the ancient ancestors who didn't care, the ones who didn't give a frick about the rustling in the bushes, about predators, about the social dynamics of their tribe, they were eaten. They were ostracized and left to starve. Caring is literally survival. The amygdala, which is the emotional processing center of your brain, is essentially a highly tuned threat detection machine. We are the descendants of the anxious apes. We are biologically mandated to give a frick about something, because caring is the absolute mechanism of survival. So here's what this episode is actually about. The mission here is to reframe that entire premise. The question is not whether you should care about things. You do not get a say in that. Your brain will force you to care. The real question, the only question that actually dictates the trajectory of your life, is what gets your care. Now I want you to think about your attention, your cognitive load, not as some limitless well, but as the CPU and RAM on a computer. You have a hard-coded, absolute limit to your processing power every single day. The operating system of life is going to force you to use that RAM. You cannot leave it at 0%. It is always running something. But you, and only you, get to decide which programs are actually running. If 90% of your mental RAM is eaten up by background anxiety programs, stressing over what a stranger thinks of your outfit, obsessing over a rude email, fuming over traffic, your system is going to crash. It crashes when you try to boot up the actual demanding software of your life goals. You are forced to spend the processing power, but you choose the investments, you choose the applications, and that's exactly why Bukowski is the ideal starting point for Manson. Because Bukowski did not succeed because he suddenly decided to adopt a falsely positive mindset. He wasn't doing daily affirmations in the mirror. He didn't sit in his squalid apartment reciting mantras about how he was a brilliant, radiant, successful author. He succeeded because he radically, brutally accepted his own flaws. He knew who he was. He knew he was a drunk. He knew he was deeply flawed. He stopped running those background programs, the ones trying to make him a model citizen, trying to write polite, sanitized poetry that would fit into society's neat little mid-century boxes. He reallocated all of his limited processing power into one single application, writing with brutal, unfiltered honesty. He channeled his finite budget entirely into his art, and he wholly accepted all the pain, the poverty, and the rejections that came as the operating cost of that choice. It strips away all the glamour. But beneath that raw exterior, beneath the bright orange cover and the edgy title, we need to look at what this book is actually doing mechanically. Because Manson didn't just invent these concepts in a vacuum. The actual underlying architecture of this book is a massive exercise in translation. Manson has essentially taken roughly 3,000 years of dense human philosophy. We are talking about the hardcore tenets of stoicism, the foundational principles of Buddhism, and the core arguments of mid-century existentialism, and he translated them for a modern audience. He took the profound meditations of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the letters of Seneca, the Eastern philosophy popularized by Alan Watts, and the absurdism of Albert Camus, and he ran them all through a modern linguistic filter. He basically translated them for the exhausted, overstimulated 21st century brain. The original texts of these philosophies are dense, they are academic, and often totally impenetrable to the casual reader. So Manson stripped out the heavy prose, he removed the ancient Roman political context and the high-minded academic framing, and then he injected a very heavy dose of profanity. He sprinkled in some ridiculous, highly relatable stories about burritos and talking pandas. The disappointment panda, yes. He repackaged the wisdom of the ancients for people who are anxiously scrolling their smartphones at 2 in the morning. Now, there is a legitimate critique of this methodology, and it comes up repeatedly in the research. Is the heavy use of profanity just a cheap algorithmic gimmick to sell books to millennials? Or is it a calculated psychological tool? Here's what's fascinating. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called schema violation. A schema is the mental framework, the expectation you have going into a specific situation. So when you pick up a self-help book, your schema expects soothing, coddling language. You expect a warm hug. You expect the author to tell you that you are uniquely special, that the universe has a grand plan for you, and that you just need to unlock your inner potential. And if Manson had written a gentle, soothing book about accepting your flaws, it would have perfectly matched that schema, and therefore it would have been completely ignored. It would have vanished into the sea of thousands of other gentle, soothing books promising eternal happiness. So the profanity is intentional, the profanity, the aggressive casualness, all of it. It is a deliberate schema violation. It acts as a pattern interrupt. It shakes the reader out of their zombified consumption. It acts as a necessary counter-agent to the coddling, feel-good mindset that Manson argues has deeply infected modern society. It's a literary slap in the face, meant to jolt your nervous system awake, before delivering a very heavy Stoic lesson. Now, if ancient philosophy is the medicine hidden inside the burrito, we really need to examine the modern disease that Manson is trying to cure. Why do we need the slap in the first place? And that leads us straight to the core problem with the modern obsession with positivity. This is what Manson diagnoses as the feedback loop from hell, and I want to spend some real time on the mechanics of this, because I think it affects absolutely everyone listening. It's the experience of feeling bad about feeling bad, feeling guilty for feeling guilty, getting incredibly anxious about the mere fact that you are experiencing anxiety. To understand the neurological trap of this loop, you have to look at the massive environmental shift between previous generations and today. Think about your grandfather's day. If your grandfather felt like, to use the book's phrasing, a cow turd one Tuesday afternoon, what was his internal monologue? He probably just thought, well, this is life. I feel awful today. I guess that's just the human condition. And he went right back to shoveling hay, or working at the factory, or fixing the plumbing. The feeling didn't stop him. The negative emotion was processed as a passing weather pattern. It wasn't an indictment of his entire existence, because the environment didn't actively punish him for having a bad mood. But look at the modern psychological landscape. It's a completely different world. Today, you feel a vague sense of sadness for 5 minutes, And what is the immediate reflexive action? You open your phone, and the moment you open that screen, you are instantly relentlessly bombarded by a highly curated, algorithmically optimized feed of images of people having absolutely spectacular lives, best case scenario lives, people getting married on pristine beaches, 16-year-olds doing unboxing videos of Ferraris, some 22-year-old who just made $1 billion inventing a crypto app, and meanwhile you're sitting in your sweatpants on a stained couch. That stark contrast is exactly what initiates the loop. Our brains are hardwired for social comparison. It's biological. It's how early humans determined their status in the tribe. But the tribe used to be 50 people. Now the tribe is 8 billion people. And the algorithm only shows you the top 0.1% of their best moments. So you see those images and your brain runs a comparison protocol. And it concludes, I am feeling sad. But literally everyone else on earth is ecstatic. Therefore, there must be something fundamentally, structurally broken inside of me for feeling this sadness. So the sadness compounds. You aren't just experiencing the baseline emotion of sadness anymore. You are now sad that you are sad, anxious about your anxiety. You feel intense guilt over your guilt. You are entirely trapped in a recursive feedback loop of suffering. Now this brings us to the philosophical antidote, which is heavily drawn from the mid-century philosopher Alan Watts. Manson leans hard on Watts's concept of the backwards law, and the psychological mechanism behind it is one of the most profound realizations a person can have. The backwards law states that the desire for a more positive experience is, in and of itself, a negative experience. Let me repeat that. The desire for a more positive experience is a negative experience. And paradoxically, the acceptance of a negative experience is, in and of itself, a positive experience. Here's the psychology of pursuit. Pursuing the positive actively highlights what you lack. Think about it. If you are standing in front of a mirror, chanting daily affirmations that you are beautiful and successful, the very act of needing to chant those words reinforces the deep subconscious belief that you do not feel beautiful or successful. The pursuit creates the deficit. If you are desperately chasing wealth, you will perpetually feel poor, regardless of how many millions are in your bank account, because the identity of the chaser is defined by the absence of the thing being chased. The psychological framework here is actually related to ironic process theory. The more you try to suppress a negative thought or force a positive one, the more cognitive resources you allocate to monitoring that exact thought. Conversely, pursuing the negative generates the positive. Think about the biological reality of the gym, the intense physical pain, the micro tears in your muscle fibers, the sheer cardiovascular exhaustion you pursue in that room. That profoundly negative physical experience is the exact mechanism that generates health, resilience, and strength. The pain is the point. The excruciating failures you endure while building a business are the precise data points that build your competence and eventual success. Willingly suffering through the visceral physiological response of your fears is the only known psychological mechanism to build actual courage. Avoiding suffering is not a neutral state. Avoiding suffering is in itself a compounding form of suffering. So if you are listening to this right now, I want you to visualize this feedback loop from hell as a pit of quicksand. When you step into quicksand, your biological panic response screams at you to fight. It tells you to struggle, to kick, to obsess over the negative sensation of sinking, and to violently demand to be back on solid ground, which is the worst thing you can do. Because the physical mechanics of quicksand mean that the more you violently fight the mud, the faster it pulls you under. The only way to survive quicksand is to do the exact opposite of what your panic demands. You have to lay back, spread your weight, radically accept the terrifying reality of the mud. You survive not by fighting the negative experience, but by surrendering to its presence. And when a culture refuses to accept negative experiences, when it obsesses over constant, unbroken, effortless positivity, it naturally breeds a secondary psychological virus. It breeds a culture of deep entitlement and false exceptionalism. Now, the research highlights a specific anecdote about a guy Manson calls Jimmy, and every single person listening to this knows a Jimmy. Jimmy is the guy who is perpetually rolling. You run into him at a coffee shop, and before you can even order your drink, he immediately starts rattling off his dizzying array of ventures, the elite consulting firms he's advising, the secretive angel investors he's meeting with next week, the revolutionary new gas pump app he's developing. That is absolutely guaranteed to make him billions. He is constantly name-dropping, constantly projecting this aura of world-spinning momentum. But if you actually audit Jimmy's life, he never does the hard, unglamorous work. The app never launches. The investors never materialize. Jimmy lives entirely inside a fragile narcissistic bubble of completely unearned confidence. He operates on the delusion that he is inherently exceptional without ever having submitted himself to the grueling process of doing anything exceptional. That is entitlement in its purest form. But what makes Manson's analysis so incisive is that he doesn't just stop at the narcissist, he explores what you could call the horseshoe theory of entitlement. Because entitlement isn't just about feeling superior to everyone, like Jimmy. It isn't just walking around thinking you are a misunderstood genius who deserves the world handed to you on a silver platter. There is a dark inverse mirror to Jimmy. The other edge of entitlement is viewing yourself as a constant, perpetual victim. It's the deeply held belief that you are uniquely cursed, that your specific problems are mathematically worse and more complex than anyone else's in human history, and that society must therefore constantly cater to your specific feelings, triggers, and sensibilities. Now, both the grandiose narcissist and the permanent victim appear to be total opposites, but they share the exact same core psychological delusion. They both fundamentally believe they are special. They believe the normal rules of human suffering, compromise, and resilience do not apply to them, and they believe the universe owes them an altered reality. Both are incredibly toxic because both separate the individual from the reality of process. The research highlights this with a brilliant analogy about the desire to be a rock star. If you poll 100 people, a huge percentage will say they would love to be a rock star. But what they are actually saying is, I want the dopamine rush of the reward. They want the visceral roar of the crowd, the fame, the money, the iconic image of standing on stage under the lights, pouring their heart out to thousands of adoring fans. But they want absolutely no part of the process. They don't want the brutal, unglamorous logistics of hauling 40 pounds of awkward audio gear up 3 flights of stairs in a rainy, urine-soaked alley at 2 in the morning. They don't want the crushing frustration of booking gigs at empty dive bars that pay $0, dealing with shattered guitar strings, blown tube amps, internal band politics, and rehearsing the same repetitive bass line for 6 hours straight until their fingers bleed. They want the victory, but they refuse the fight. Here's the thing, the universe doesn't operate on a reward-only paradigm. Who you are is defined not by what you want to enjoy, but by what kind of pain you are willing to sustain. That is the real metric. The people who genuinely enjoy the burning lungs and aching joints of a daily run are the ones who run marathons. The people who actually tolerate the grueling work weeks, the tedious spreadsheets, and the corporate politics are the ones who climb the executive ladder. And here's the mechanism that drives all of this. Giving a frick about everything equally, expecting constant greatness, constant comfort, constant happiness, and demanding the spectacular reward without the agonizing pain results in the exact same psychological paralysis as giving a frick about nothing. The entitled narcissist and the apathetic slacker arrive at the exact same destination, a total inability to act. Slow, agonizing disappearance of a meaningful life. The only known cure for this entitlement trap is to consciously, deliberately choose a struggle that costs you something real. So if the traps are entitlement, toxic positivity, and the refusal of process, how do we actually execute the subtle art in our daily lives? Manson breaks this down into 3 very specific subtleties, 3 rules of the road for allocating your cognitive budget. Subtlety number 1 directly addresses the biological reality we opened with. Not giving a frick does not mean indifference. It means being comfortable with being different. This is a vital distinction, because true clinical indifference is not cool or edgy. It is a manifestation of profound fear. Truly indifferent people are often terrified. They are the internet trolls, and the detached couch potatoes hiding from the world in a grey, emotionless, heavily armoured pit of their own making. They are so paralyzed by the fear of judgment or the fear of failure that they preemptively reject everything. They pretend to care about nothing, so that nothing can hurt them. It is a defense mechanism, not a philosophy. And Manson illustrates the difference between apathy and targeted caring with a very intense personal anecdote. He writes about a time his mother was scammed out of a significant chunk of her life savings by a close friend. Now, if Manson were truly indifferent in the slacker, apathetic sense of the word, he would have just shrugged his shoulders, told his mom that money is an illusion anyway, sipped his iced mocha, and gone back to binge-watching television. But he doesn't chill out. He explodes. He gets intensely, righteously furious. He tells his mother they are going to lawyer up, they are going to track this person down, and they are going to reclaim the money. He basically says, I don't give a frick what it takes. I will ruin this guy's life if I have to. He does not care about the adversity of the impending lawsuit. He doesn't care about the immense stress, the financial cost of the lawyers, or the highly uncomfortable personal confrontation. He is indifferent to the obstacle, but he deeply, passionately, aggressively cares about justice for his mother. He is saying frick it to the discomfort, but he is completely 100% invested in the value of protecting his family. Now, that righteous anger only works if the target is actually worth it. The problem is most people are firing off that exact same level of biological intensity at entirely the wrong targets, which leads us to subtlety number 2. To ignore petty adversity, you must care about something more important than the adversity itself. Consider the everyday scenarios that completely derail people's mental health. Think of the elderly lady screaming at a terrified grocery store cashier over an expired 30-cent coupon. From a biological standpoint, why is she deploying so much adrenaline? Why is she spending her finite, precious cognitive energy and raising her blood pressure over 30 cents? Because she has absolutely nothing more important going on in her life. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human mind. If you are stressing out to the point of a migraine over the batteries dying in the TV remote, or if you are stewing with toxic rage for 3 days because of a photo your ex posted on social media, or if you are plotting revenge over a minor perceived slight from a coworker, that is a glaring psychological symptom. It means you lack a legitimate, meaningful focus in your life. Because you haven't assigned your cognitive budget to a grander purpose, your brain automatically defaults to spending it on trivialities. And that brings us to subtlety number 3. You are always choosing. You cannot escape the allocation of your attention. But the beautiful, redeeming mechanism of human biology is that as we age, this process naturally refines itself. In developmental psychology, there is a concept called socio-emotional selectivity theory. When you are a teenager, your time horizon feels infinite, so you care about absolutely everything. You give a frick about the exact shade of your shoes, whether a classmate texted you back within 3 minutes, what your hair looks like when the wind blows. Everything is life or death. But maturity is the biological and psychological process of your energy levels dropping and your time horizon shrinking. As we age, your brain naturally begins pruning your concerns. You realize that the opinions of strangers at the mall have zero impact on your survival. You realize that most of those devastating early rejections were actually course corrections. You naturally prune your cares down to a concentrated core. Your immediate family, a few close friends, maybe your golf swing or your garden. And ironically, that stripping away of external cares is what generates profound, stable happiness later in life. So, if you are listening right now, I want you to run a quick psychological audit. Think about your life for the last 48 hours. What minor inconvenience is currently taking up space in your RAM? What petty argument, what frustrating email, or what minor traffic incident is eating away at your daily budget? And more importantly, what does that reveal about your larger goals? Because if you have the excess emotional bandwidth to be genuinely angry about a TV remote, what terrifyingly important life project are you currently avoiding? That audit forces a confrontation with our metrics. Because if we are constantly forced to choose what to care about, The crucial next step is evaluating the actual instruments we use to measure success. We have to evaluate our values. Manson draws a very stark, unyielding line here. He defines bad values as any metric that relies on external, uncontrollable factors, things like popularity, material wealth relative to your peers, or the demand to forcibly stay positive all the time. Look at the mechanics of this. If your primary core value is "I must be universally liked by everyone I meet," you are guaranteeing yourself a life of severe anxiety, because you have outsourced your self-worth to a variable you cannot control. You cannot control the neural pathways of other people's minds. Your identity is entirely at the mercy of strangers' moods. It is a mathematically unwinnable game. You are betting your mental health on a roulette wheel every time you leave the house. But good values are entirely internal. They are completely within your locus of control. Values like radical honesty, standing up for a friend, maintaining curiosity, or taking responsibility for your actions. You have absolute control over whether you act honestly, regardless of how the world reacts to that honesty. You own the metric. You control the scoreboard. Now, there is a thought experiment in the research that illustrates the power of this internal locus of control perfectly. I want you to picture this scenario. Imagine you are asleep in your bed. Someone violently kicks in your front door, breaks into your house, puts a loaded gun to your head, and forces you out into the street. They force you at gunpoint to run 26.2 miles. It would be the most traumatizing, physically agonizing, horrific psychological torture imaginable. You would be the victim of a severe crime, and it would likely take years of therapy to recover from the PTSD, total powerlessness. But now imagine a completely different context. Imagine you wake up one day and decide of your own free will that you want to run a marathon. You go to the specialty store. You buy the expensive gel-cushioned running shoes. You willingly set your alarm for 4:30 in the morning for 6 straight months to train in the freezing rain. Finally, race day comes. You run the exact same 26.2 miles. You hit the wall at mile 20. Your feet are bleeding. Your joints are screaming in agony. But you push through and cross the finish line with your friends and family cheering you on. And in that moment, exhausted and in pain, it is the proudest, most defining achievement of your entire life. Here is the crux of the entire philosophy. The objective physiological reality. The act of running 26.2 miles, the exact same lactic acid buildup, the exact same micro tears in the muscles, the exact same caloric burn and physical exhaustion is perfectly 100% identical in both scenarios. The biological pain is the same. The only difference is agency. The only difference is choice. Choice completely alters the neurological processing of the pain. In psychology, this aligns with self-determination theory. When you actively choose the struggle based on your own internal autonomous values, the pain is contextualized as positive, empowering stress that builds identity. But when the exact same physical struggle is forced upon you, or when you interpret your life purely through the lens of being a victim of circumstance, the pain is processed as toxic distress, and it destroys you. This is why Manson is so adamant about taking responsibility for your life, even for the tragedies and setbacks that are objectively not your fault. Now that might sound harsh, taking responsibility for things that aren't your fault. But here is the distinction. You aren't taking responsibility for the cause of the trauma. You are taking responsibility for the response, because doing so reclaims your agency, and it transforms the pain from torture into fuel. But reclaiming that agency is hard, especially when you are completely paralyzed by anxiety or depression. So when you are stuck, when you genuinely cannot figure out your values or your next move, Manson offers a highly practical tool he calls the do something principle. And this fundamentally rewires how we think about motivation. Culturally, we view motivation as a linear chain reaction. We think it goes like this. First, you get a magical spark of emotional inspiration. That inspiration generates a feeling of motivation. And finally, that motivation results in a physical action. So what do? We sit around waiting for the lightning bolt of inspiration to strike so we can finally start writing the book or going to the gym. But waiting for inspiration is a cognitive trap. Manson argues that the sequence is not a straight line. It is an endless, continuous loop. action, inspiration, motivation, and because it's a loop, you can hack the system by entering it at any point. If you lack motivation, you don't wait, you simply force the physical action. The physical action alters your state, which causes inspiration, which in turn generates the motivation to continue. Action leads to inspiration. Inspiration leads to motivation. You just do something, anything. If you want to be a writer, but you have writer's block, you don't wait for the muse. You just write one terrible, grammatically incorrect sentence. The mere physical act of moving your fingers on the keyboard breaks the paralysis and generates the momentum to write the next one. And this is not just a catchy self-help slogan, it is deeply rooted in clinical psychology. In cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a highly effective treatment protocol for severe clinical depression called behavioral activation. When a patient is severely depressed, their dopamine pathways are compromised, they have literally zero physiological motivation. If a therapist tells them to wait until they feel like getting out of bed, they will stay in that bed indefinitely. So what is the clinical treatment? The therapist prescribes microscopically small, manageable physical actions. Don't worry about being happy, just physically put your feet on the floor. Now walk to the mailbox. The physical action initiates a neurochemical cascade that alters the brain chemistry, eventually sparking the motivation that the patient falsely believed had to come first. Manson has effectively taken behavioral activation, stripped out the clinical terminology, and rebranded it as the do-something principle. But applying the do-something principle and actively choosing your values guarantees one extremely uncomfortable, inevitable outcome. You are going to fail. And we have to dive into the mechanics of failure and uncertainty because our modern culture has a deeply dysfunctional relationship with failure. We try to scrub it away. We sanitize our feed so we only see the victories. We view failure as an endpoint rather than a data collection process. There is a story in the research about Picasso that illustrates this cultural blind spot perfectly. The story goes that Pablo Picasso, in his later years, is sitting at a cafe table in Spain, drinking a coffee and idly doodling on a used paper napkin. A woman sitting nearby recognizes him and watches in absolute awe. After a few minutes, Picasso finishes his coffee, crumples up the napkin, and gets up to throw it away. The woman rushes over and frantically says, "Wait, please, can I have that napkin you were just drawing on? I'll pay you whatever you want for it." And Picasso looks at her, holds up the crumpled napkin, and says, "Sure, that will be $20,000. The woman is completely shocked. She stammers, "What? 20,000? But it took you like 2 minutes to draw that." And Picasso replies, "No, ma'am, it took me over 60 years to draw this." And he stuffs the napkin in his pocket and walks out of the cafe. It's a brilliant illustration of the hidden architecture of success. When we look at a master in any field, we only see the absolute tip of the iceberg breaking the surface of the water. We see the 2-minute doodle that is suddenly worth 20 grand. What we intentionally ignore is the massive, submerged, crushing mountain of failure underneath it. We don't see Picasso's thousands of terrible derivative early paintings. We don't see the crushing rejections, the years of starving, the relentless experimentation, and the millions of wrong strokes. Because improvement at any complex task is mathematically based on thousands of tiny, iterative failures. If someone is vastly better than you at something, it is almost a statistical guarantee that they have failed at it vastly more times than you have even tried. But we fiercely avoid failure, not just because it hurts, but because it threatens the very foundation of how we see ourselves. Manson codifies this as Manson's law of avoidance, the psychological principle that the more a specific action or outcome threatens your core identity, the more aggressively you will avoid doing it. From a young age, we build a narrative framework about who we are. I am the smart, effortless achiever. I am the fearless entrepreneur. I am the easygoing friend who never causes drama. That narrative becomes our psychological anchor. Anything that contradicts it causes a severe state of cognitive dissonance, which the brain interprets as a literal threat to its survival. Now, there is a legitimate tension here worth addressing. Evolutionary psychology tells us that identity preservation is a vital survival mechanism. Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development argue that we need a cohesive identity to function in society. If we are constantly dismantling our self-image just to avoid feeling fragile, don't we risk falling into total role confusion? We need an ego to operate. So how do we balance the need for a stable identity with the need to risk that identity by failing? That is the central tension of ego psychology. And the nuance here is the difference between a brittle identity and a flexible identity. Manson isn't arguing for ego death. He is arguing for high ego complexity. Here is a practical, devastating example. Imagine someone whose entire identity framework is built around being the nice guy, the accommodating peacemaker. That is their metric for survival. As long as everyone likes me and I cause no friction, I am safe. Now imagine they find themselves in a highly toxic romantic relationship or a completely exploitative job where they are being abused. To set a firm boundary, to loudly say no, to intentionally cause a major conflict, would fundamentally shatter their identity as the accommodating peacemaker. It would feel like a psychological death. Their brain will rationalize avoiding the confrontation at all costs. They will endure profound abuse simply to protect the brittle narrative that they are nice. So how do they break free? They don't need to destroy their identity, they need to expand it. They have to be willing to let the rigid version of that identity die and say, I am not just a nice guy, I am a complex person who values kindness, but who also forcefully protects my own boundaries, which requires the active cultivation of rejection. You have to reject external validation as your primary metric. You have to develop the psychological fortitude to both confidently say the word no and calmly hear the word no. Rejection is a necessary orienting tool. If you never reject anything, if you never say no to a bad job, a toxic friend, or a flawed ideology, you don't actually stand for anything. Your life becomes a formless, valueless void, driven only by the immediate avoidance of pain. Now, having thoroughly mapped out Manson's worldview and the psychological architecture he built, we need to take a sharp pivot, because a deep dive of this magnitude would be intellectually dishonest if we only presented one side. This book is a cultural juggernaut, but it also triggered massive polarization and severe pushback, and the backlash is just as fascinating as the success. We need to examine it impartially to give you a completely holistic view of the material. The critiques highlight the friction points where Manson's translation of stoicism grates against modern sensibilities or clinical realities, and they are highly varied. Let's start with the most immediate, surface-level critique. The tone, the vocabulary, and the structural repetition of the writing itself. Across critical reviews and several massive Reddit threads, a very consistent critique emerges: the extreme simplicity and repetitiveness of the prose. One notable commenter, a former teacher operating under the handle Utah Hiker 801, stated they were trained to analyze reading levels and they judged the entirety of Manson's book to be written solidly at a 4th grade comprehension level. They expressed intense frustration that there wasn't a single complex sentence or nuanced paragraph that required a second read. It is a valid structural observation. Another reviewer brought up a fantastic cultural idiom from Denmark to describe the pacing. The Danish phrase slavsild. It literally translates to the act of dragging a single pickled herring across multiple pieces of dry bread, just to give them a faint hint of flavor. This reviewer felt that Manson had exactly one core valid philosophical idea, and he just dragged that single pickled herring across 250 pages of filler burrito jokes and repetitive anecdotes. That is a brutally vivid critique. Moving beyond the prose, there is the heavy cultural label applied to the book, the bro philosophy critique. Critics argue that Manson essentially took profound, historically significant stoicism and cynically repackaged it with the aesthetic of an early 2000s edgelord. Philosophy algorithmically designed to appeal to a demographic of young men who mistake vulgarity for depth, which naturally bleeds into critiques of the author's own persona within the text. Reviewers frequently noted a jarring tonal shift. In the early chapters, Manson heavily references his past, boasting about traveling the globe, sleeping around, and detailing his early career running a dating advice blog for men. Some reviewers noted that while the first half of the book felt genuinely philosophical, the second half completely derailed. They felt Manson transitioned from a philosophical translator into someone dispensing incredibly superficial, highly subjective relationship advice rather than any clinical foundation. The relationship advice section struck a major nerve. One deep dive review pointed out a highly specific, polarizing example. In the book, Manson proudly details an interaction with his wife. He claims that if his wife spends an hour getting meticulously dressed up, and he thinks her outfit looks bad, he will look her dead in the eye and brutally tell her she looks terrible. He frames this as a high moral virtue, claiming that his commitment to radical honesty is vastly more important than the temporary comfort of sparing her feelings. Reviewers strongly, clinically pushed back on that framing. They stated that there is a massive, highly defined psychological line between radical honesty and a fundamental lack of cognitive empathy. True, mature communication involves the active consideration of a partner's emotional state, and Manson's approach read less like noble stoic truth-telling and more like a convenient justification for simply being unkind. But the heaviest, most serious critique, the one that requires the most careful analysis, is regarding Manson's stance on trauma. Manson takes a very aggressive, unyielding stance against what he labels victimhood chic. He argues that modern culture actively incentivizes people to claim victim status. To counter this, he pushes the hardcore stoic idea that you are 100% responsible for how you respond to absolutely everything in your life. This is where the translation of ancient philosophy meets the hard reality of modern clinical psychology. Critics, particularly trauma specialists, argue that applying this rigid blanket philosophy is actively dangerous. Applying a rigid take, absolute responsibility mentality to someone who has survived severe systemic abuse or someone suffering from complex PTSD is fundamentally flawed. We know from modern neuroscience that severe trauma compromises the brain's ability to choose a response. Critics argue that aggressively pushing stoic responsibility onto a severe trauma survivor can be incredibly invalidating, bordering on victim blaming. So we have this massive spectrum of critique: the fourth grade writing level, the pickled herring repetition, the bro philosophy aesthetic, the highly questionable empathy in his relationship advice, and the potential clinical danger of his stance on trauma. Now, if we zoom out and look at this objectively, does the messenger fundamentally corrupt the message? It is crucial to state that we are impartially presenting these views, neither endorsing the book as an infallible gospel, nor validating every single critique as absolute truth. What it highlights is the inherently subjective, highly contextual nature of the entire self-help genre. The utility of a self-help book is almost entirely dependent on the specific developmental stage of the reader. It's like stumbling across a hand-drawn map when you are freezing and lost deep in the woods. In that context, the map is a literal miracle. But if someone hands you that exact same crudely drawn map when you are already sitting comfortably in your living room with a GPS, you look at it and say, well, yeah, obviously the river is over there. This is a terrible drawing. Manson's aggressive, profane, pattern-interrupting tone might be the exact necessary frequency required to penetrate the thick, apathetic defenses of a detached young adult who is doom-scrolling the internet. But to a seasoned mental health professional, or someone who has already deeply internalized the works of Marcus Aurelius, the packaging feels juvenile and lacking in nuance. The core underlying truths, that you must actively curate your values, that you must accept the inevitability of suffering, remain psychologically robust. But the delivery vehicle used to transport those truths is, and will remain, highly polarizing. It really is a fascinating cultural Rorschach test. But eventually, we have to cut through all that noise. We have to push past the internet critics, the burrito jokes, the debates over tone, and even the Bukowski references, because at the very end of the text, Manson strips away all the humor and brings the philosophy down to its ultimate, sobering, unavoidable baseline, the absolute final metric for evaluating the choices we make. Manson ends the book by painting a very vivid, incredibly quiet scene, He describes standing on a high cliff at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, looking out over the vast churning drop into the ocean. The wind is howling, and in that isolated moment, he is thinking about a close friend of his who died tragically and unexpectedly young. Standing on that cliff edge, he writes that he isn't trying to be highly motivated, he is just intensely, quietly present, and standing near that sheer drop, contemplating the physical reality of his own fragile mortality, he experiences a moment of brutal, clarifying honesty about what is actually worth the weight of his attention. This imagery is a direct, unfiltered lineage to the ancient Stoic practice of memento mori, the Latin reminder that you must inevitably die. Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, they all heavily utilized a cognitive practice known as premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, and it is crucial to understand that this was not a morbid, depressing obsession with the macabre. The psychological practice is to actively, vividly, and intentionally imagine the total loss of everything you love and value. On the surface, that sounds like a recipe for a panic attack, but the underlying psychological mechanism is profoundly liberating. You do not imagine these losses to invoke misery. You do it to artificially reset your baseline of expectation. When you reset your baseline to zero, to death, it instantly and brutally clarifies the staggering value of what you currently possess. When you deeply internalize the reality that your parents will inevitably die, the petty, frustrating argument you had with them yesterday suddenly vanishes completely from your cognitive budget. When you remember that your own timeline is strictly finite, the background anxiety over a stranger's opinion of you on the internet instantly evaporates. Death is the ultimate, infallible filter. It ruthlessly strips away all the bad external values and leaves only what is true, what is immediate, and what is vitally important. Which brings this entire exploration full circle, right back to the hook, right back to the dirt in San Pedro, California, right back to the grave of Charles Bukowski, and those two words, don't try, don't try. Because don't try doesn't mean you shouldn't put effort into your existence, it means you must stop trying to be something you fundamentally aren't. Stop trying to care about the trivial metrics and the shiny distractions simply because a massive algorithmic society demands that you do. The subtle art is not the performative, edgy coolness of deciding nothing matters. It is not slack or apathy. It is exact, surgical precision. It is the unglamorous, daily, completely exhausting work of figuring out what actually deserves the heavy weight of your one finite life, and then giving absolutely everything else the exact response it deserves. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It is a lifelong, relentless audit of your own attention. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the philosophy, the psychology, and the backlash, I want to leave you with a lingering thought, a practical application to sit with right now, wherever you are listening to this. Imagine, just for a fleeting moment, that your absolute total processing budget is permanently running out tomorrow at exactly noon. The account is closing forever. The screen is going black. If you knew that for a fact, what is the one intensely stressful, agonizing thing currently dominating your mind that would immediately, instantly drop off your list? And what terrifyingly important thing would suddenly, undeniably take its place,